Hello everyone, and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, J.P. Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire. Episode 13, Children of the Wolf. Before getting into today's show, I'd just like to mention that while we were away, Spotify added podcast ratings. So if you're listening on Spotify and enjoying the show, please leave a 5-star rating. Ratings and reviews boost the podcast's visibility and help new listeners discover us. In our early episodes, we talked about the Proto-Indo-European homeland, how linguists reconstructing language concluded that the Indo-European language family originated from a steppe homeland, or Urheimat, and how later archaeologists provided supporting evidence. In recent years, genetic research has provided further proof, vindicating linguists who believed that they could reconstruct lost language and confirming the high probability of steppe origins. Although scholarly debate over what exactly happened where is ongoing, and some still continue to support alternative theories, we can say that there is more or less a consensus that the Proto-Indo-European homeland was in the Western Steppe. Over the next few episodes, we will be looking at early Turkic migrations into the Western Steppe. So the question naturally arises of where the Turkic and Proto-Turkic homeland was. Unfortunately, we do not have any such similar consensus on Turkic origins. Similarly, we have no real equivalent to the classical texts on the Scythians, which taken together with the archaeological evidence, allow us to build a reasonably clear picture of who they were. Instead, we have a few somewhat chaotic centuries where numerous groups appear out of the steppe or the mountains. Dozens of names are used, with it often being unclear whether they are referring to the same people or different people, and then new groups appear before they manage to establish themselves. Byzantine texts often just refer to anyone in the steppe as Scythians, even hundreds of years after the Scythians had disappeared, and most of their descriptions of the new peoples appearing are generic, ride horses, eat meat, drink milk, nomad stereotypes. And although the Turkic peoples most likely emerged in the east, Chinese sources are not much more help. As leading Turkologist Peter Golden writes, quote, "Of the 59 peoples of Inner Asia noted in the Chinese sources, these accounts provide information on the languages of only 18. Of these, only 3 can be identified with surety, and educated guesses can be offered on another 3. Unquote. But don't worry, I'm not planning to get bogged down in a dozen episodes covering all the ins and outs and competing theories. This episode will be a high-level overview of where the Turkic people came from, and then in the next episodes, we will be moving on to the Turkic peoples as they migrate into the Western Steppe and establish themselves around the Caspian, the Black Sea, and the Volga. That is not to say that everything that happens further east is irrelevant to our story. I plan to revisit some aspects in greater detail in supplementary episodes at a later date. So, on with the show. What origin stories did the Turkic peoples tell about themselves? By the 6th century, the Turk Empire had appeared in Central Asia. Turk is spelt like Turk, but with an umlaut over the U. The Turk had broken away from the Xiongnu, who, if you recall, were one of the nomadic peoples on the borders of China, who had triggered previous waves of migration westward. The Turk were not the first Turkic people. but the Turk Empire was the first polity where the Turkic people were dominant, and one of the three, Xiongnu, Turk, and Chinggisid Mongol, that played the greatest role in determining the formations of the Turkic peoples. Contemporary Chinese imperial histories include several versions of the origins of the Turk, which they mostly inquired directly from the source. According to one tale, the Turk were a Xiongnu tribe living on the right bank of the Western Sea, a Chinese term that could refer to anything from lakes in Mongolia and eastern Central Asia through to the Aral Sea, Caspian Sea, Black Sea, Mediterranean, or even Red Sea, as the case may be. A neighbouring state attacked and destroyed them. One badly injured boy was thrown into a swamp to hide from the invaders, where he survived thanks to the care of a she-wolf. In a rather improbable turn of events, he went on to impregnate the wolf. However, his enemies discovered that he had survived and came hunting him. The wolf fled north into the mountains, where she gave birth in a cave to a litter of 10 sons. One son took the name Ashuna, made himself the leader, and adopted a wolf's head standard, being proud of his origins. The sons married local women, and their tribe grew. After several generations, they moved into the foothills of the Jinshan, which means Golden Mountain, or in Turkic, Altai, and became metalworkers for the Roran, a Proto-Mongolic group. Another history provides a different version. In this one, their tribe of either 17 or 70 brothers lived to the north of the Xiongnu. The historian says that they were all rather stupid, except for Iji Inishidu, who was the son of a wolf, which gave him great intelligence and supernatural powers to control the elements. He took the daughters of the spirit of summer and winter to wife. They bore him sons, one of whom invented fire, saving the tribe and taking the name Turk. He had 10 wives, and their sons took their mothers' names. The youngest was the son of a concubine, and took the name Ashuna. He was elected leader of all the people after winning a jumping contest, and was eventually succeeded by one Bumin, an actual historical figure the records name as the First Türk Qagan. A third history, the Sui Shu, provides a more historical account. In this one, the Turk are described as mixed barbarians, among whom there was a family named Ashuna. When the Northern Wei Emperor defeated the northern Liang Xiongnu state, the Ashuna led a band of refugees to the Altai, where they made a name for themselves as metalworkers. Of course, the Turk were not actually descended from wolves, although Turkic peoples would keep the wolf as their emblem. The Bashkir people in modern Russia are called Bashkorts in their own language, which some linguists interpret as meaning chief wolves or wolf leaders, while in Turkey, the far-right organization officially known as the Idealist Club's Educational and Cultural Foundation is popularly known as the Grey Wolves. But let's jump back a bit and look at where the Turk actually came from. There are several theories. Some argue that the ancestors of the Turkic peoples moved from the west to the east, but that position has less support than them going the other way. The most likely scenario is that the Turkic peoples resulted from an intermingling of pastoralist Mongolic peoples from the eastern steppe with sedentary hunter-gatherer people from the forest steppe zone, with the easternmost Iranic peoples and Paleo-Siberians also contributing. However, concrete evidence remains scant and often contradictory, and the linguistic reconstructions are weaker than for Indo-European languages. The Turkic equivalent of Proto-Indo-European is known as Proto-Altaic. That then divides into Proto-Western Altaic and Proto-Eastern Altaic, which loosely align with the direction their speakers migrated out of the Altai. Proto-Eastern Altaic gave rise to Proto-Mongol, and thence Mongolian, and Proto-Northern and Peninsular Altaic, the source of many eventual languages of the northern Far East, including the Tungusic languages spoken by indigenous peoples of eastern Siberia and northern China, Korean, and Japanese. Proto-Western Altaic split into Proto-Common Turkic and Proto-Bulgaric. Today, only the Chuvash language remains from the Bulgaric line, also referred to as Oghuric or Onoguric, although in times past it was spoken by the Bulgars and by the Khazars, and some scholars believe the Huns. All other Turkic languages in existence today derive from a common ancestor that formed in the east after the ancient Bulgaric speakers had already migrated westwards. And since I have just mentioned the Huns, let's look at them for a minute. The Huns are often lumped in with the Turkic peoples, but this is a bit inaccurate. As is sometimes noted, it's better to say that the Huns were not Turks, but the Turks were Huns. That is, the Huns were one of the peoples that contributed to the melting pot from which the Turkic peoples emerged. The Huns are usually regarded as coming from the Xiongnu people on the northern border of China. But again, the actual evidence for how this happened is lacking, and the nature of their language remains uncertain. The Hun Confederation that took over the Western Steppe and raided into Western Europe and the Roman Empire was descended from people that began their migration westwards before the Turkic peoples had emerged in the east. So Attila was not speaking a Turkic language, although there may have been people speaking early forms of Turkic in his confederation, which was very multilingual. I'm not going to get deep into the prehistory in this episode. The Xiongnu managed to maintain dominance in the east for around 500 years, with periodic outbreaks of conflict. They regularly raided the Chinese to acquire access to trade, while the Chinese made forays into Central Asia, trying to establish control as far as the Fergana Valley, which is now parts of Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. The area was historically regarded as the source of the best horses, the commodity the Chinese most wished to acquire from their nomadic neighbors. As well as the Chinese, the Xiongnu fought the Iranic peoples of the eastern steppe and Central Asia. It was these wars that displaced the Yuezhi south and west, which in turn displaced the Scythians, sending them westwards. But this should not be taken entirely as clearly distinguished peoples fighting each other. As usual on the steppe, these were confederations of people of different ethnic origins, speaking different languages, and in the course of this process, the tribes that were to become the Turkic peoples were pulled into these confederations and served as subject peoples. The first written source that can be determined to refer to Turkic speakers comes from the records of Chinese ambassadors to the Eastern barbarians, dealing with a people living in what is now Kazakhstan in the 2nd century. The Xiongnu were eventually defeated and succeeded by other dominant confederations, and by the 5th century, Turkic peoples were significant vassals of the Roran. In 1551, led by Bumin of the Ashina clan, they overthrew the Roran to establish the First Türk Qaganate and moved very quickly to expand their power. By 558, they had conquered Central Asia, southern Siberia, the Aral Sea and Volga regions, ending Iranic control of the steppe, reuniting with the Turkic peoples who had already migrated west, establishing an empire running from Crimea to Manchuria, and opening diplomatic relations with Byzantium. The empire was not only the debut of the Turks on the world stage, it was also the first time that a single power had controlled the steppe from the Chinese border to the border with the Roman Empire.
Africa is a land with endless stories to tell. From epic battles, brilliant rulers, and the dramatic rise and fall of civilizations, join us on the History of Africa podcast to learn the oft-ignored stories of the African continent. From the sands of Cairo to the plains of Zimbabwe, and from the mountains of Ethiopia to the forests of the Congo, find the History of Africa podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
As we have already seen with the Scythians, when we talk about the Turkic peoples, we are not speaking about an ethnic group in the sense of modern nations. If we look at Turkic peoples today, we can see this quite easily, as a lineup would range from Yakuts, Kyrgyz, and Kazakhs with an East Asian appearance, through to blue-eyed, white-blonde Tatars on the Volga. The Turkic identity emerged from steppe confederations of various peoples who adopted a common language and culture. The Turk Qaganate was a mixture of nomadic, sedentary, and forest peoples. Some of them still exist. Some of them have not been traced outside of the Orkhon inscriptions, a stone stele in a valley in what is now Mongolia that was the seat of Turk imperial power. The inscriptions mention over 20 peoples within the Khaganate, Turkic, Iranic, Mongolic, and others whose identity is only speculative. They include Uyghurs, Tatars, Sogdians, and Kyrgyz. The empire was split in two, a feature of Turkic rule that would be found in other subsequent states, with the senior eastern part ruled by Bumin, also sometimes referred to as Tumin, who took the title of Ilig Khagan, and the west ruled by his brother Ishteri, both of the Ashina clan. The east and west division followed common nomad naming conventions with colour and directional attributes. So the east was also known as Blue or Guk, meaning celestial, giving it the name of Gökturk. The origins of the Ashina also remain obscure. Clearly, they did not actually appear as the myths describe, but where they did come from is not known. We do not know whether they were nomads before they migrated to the Altai. We do not know why they have a special reputation for metalworking, or where they acquired these skills. And we do not even know what their relationship to the Turk was. That is, were the Ashina the ruling clan of a tribe called the Turk, or did they create a union of tribes that they called the Turk? Were the Ashina themselves Turkic? Some scholars see the word as having an Iranic derivation. The archaeological finds to date do not help us solve these questions. From the appearance of human remains, images, and more recently, genetic testing, the Altai had a population of European appearance that over time came to be dominated by people of an East Asian appearance. That is, it was Indo-European, and then Mongolic peoples migrated into the area. However, while some scholars place this transition in the 5th century, at around the time the Turk and Kyrgyz people emerged in the Altai, others place it 1,000 years earlier, with the Xiongnu bringing in the eastern element. The matter of origins is also complicated, as Mongolic peoples moving west also absorbed other Iranic and Uralic peoples, which can be seen, for example, in the Turk adopting horse burials. As always on the steppe, ethnicity is a much more amorphous notion than most people see it today. However, it seems that the strongest support is for the Turk coming from a Mongolic group in the Transbaikal area during the Xiongnu era, who moved into the Altai and to some degree combined with Indo-Europeans, Paleo-Siberians, Mongols and Tungusic peoples. Somewhat strangely, although it is clear that the Turkic peoples came from the eastern end of the steppe, it is easier to trace the early history of the earliest Turkic groups to move into the western steppe than it is to trace who the Turk were, where they came from, what they were doing between the origins of the Turkic peoples and the establishment of the First Türk Qaganate. With their defeat, the Roran were displaced and fled west, where they were known as the Avars. The Avars became a significant force in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, which was a source of some concern to the Turk, who referred to them in correspondence with Byzantium as their runaway slaves and demanded that the emperor would not have dealings with them. The Avars would go on to ally with Slavs in the west, so I will return to their story in more detail once we reach that part of the narrative. But for now, just note that they will cause a lot of problems for the Byzantines. A Central Asian steppe power, such as the Turk Qaganate, was in theory a natural ally for Constantinople, as Persia was the obvious rival for both. But having to juggle relations with both the Avars and the Turk was a conundrum. For Byzantium, the Khazars would turn out to be better allies. As a side note, for those of you who may be aware that there are a people called the Avars in the modern Russian Caucasian Republic of Dagestan, they are not the same people. The Caucasian Avars get their name from an ancient king and speak a Caucasian rather than Altaic language. The Turk were naturally influenced by the established Xiongnu and Iranic nomad cultures and adopted many of their features. The Khagans, for example, had a comitatus known as the Bori, that is, the wolves. But along with the points in common, there were significant differences. One feature you might have picked up on is there in the name of the Turk Qaganate, the institution of the Khagan, a steppe emperor, which came to be used in all succeeding steppe powers. Although the Khagan is highly significant to all the Altaic-speaking peoples, its origins are still unknown, and linguists believe it is not itself an Altaic word. Scholars have attempted to derive it from Xiongnu and Iranian sources, but their arguments remain highly speculative. Notably, while the Iranian nomadic confederations of the steppe were an undoubted influence on the Turkic peoples becoming a similar horse-based power, an equivalent of the Khaganate has not been found in Scythian and Saka societies. The language of the Xiongnu is perhaps a more plausible source, although so far without substantiation. It is at least unlikely that it comes from the forest zone ancestors of the Turkic peoples, as Chinese reports on the Paleo-Siberian tribes do not include the existence of any such organized polities. The first mentions of the Khaganate refer to the other steppe peoples around in the period between Xiongnu dominance and the First Türk Qaganate, particularly the Xianbei and Roran. Outside of the Turkic peoples, the only other rulers that were recognized as Khagans were the emperors of China and Tibet. While the leaders of the Scythians were elected by acclamation of the warriors, the Khagan held a divine mandate from heaven, something like the Chinese emperors. The Orkhon inscription reads, "Because heaven mandated it, and because I myself possessed heavenly good fortune, I became Khagan." And this status extended to the entire ruling clan, who were regarded as sacred. There was a taboo on shedding royal blood, so they were to be strangled instead. This taboo continued with the Mongols, who sometimes went to great lengths coming up with elaborate ways to dispose of royal persons without shedding their blood. The Khaganate established a tradition, continued by subsequent empires, that upon succeeding, The Khagan's first act was to issue the law, known as the Tur. Succession did not go from father to son, but rather from father to brother, and then to son. At least in theory, as this was not always followed. Where there were a number of brothers with divine status waiting their turn to have a go at being Khagan, territories were divided and assigned to them. This practice of dividing land among various royal princelings, while still considering them to be part of a single empire and the common property of the royal house, was widespread in steppe empires and those they influenced. And if you think it sounds like a perfect scenario for creating competing power bases and rivalries, you'd be right. The crowning of a Khagan was an elaborate ceremony with shamanistic rituals. The new Khagan would be hoisted up on a felt carpet and spun around 9 times, paraded on horseback before the people, and then ritually strangled with a silk scarf until the point of unconsciousness. Before he passed out, the shaman would demand he state how long his reign would be. Alongside the Khagan was his chief wife, the Khatun, and below there was a series of positions of descending hierarchy: Yagbus, Shads, Tegins, Ultaburs, and others, some of which had become hereditary rather than a matter of royal appointment. Below them all was the Karabudun, the common people. Some of these terms, Beg, Shad, Ishbara, were Iranic rather than Turkic, but it is not clear how far these people were part of the Turkic aristocracy or simply leaders of subject peoples. What the profusion of official titles for regional and military leaders, governors and tax collectors does show is that the Turk had a developed state, although questions remain as to how centralized it was. Later Turkic states and the Chinggisid Mongols would follow largely the same political structure. Byzantine observers reported that the Turk worshipped fire and air and water. They are described as singing hymns to the Creator, accompanied by animal sacrifices, with priests who would foretell the future. The Creator God, who was associated with the sky, was known as Tengri, a cult honored across Inner Asia since at least the time of the Xiongnu. The Orkhon inscriptions also reference an earth goddess, Ume, who was probably a fertility divinity. As for the priesthood, divining the future was one of the most important functions of shamans. Different tribes also had sacred mountains, and the Chinese histories say that the Khagan would make regular sacrifices at his ancestral cave. Like later steppe empires, the Turk also seem to have been tolerant to other religions, taking up Iranic and Buddhist practices, with one Khagan even considering making Buddhism the official religion of the Second Qaganate. Byzantine writers claim that Nestorian Christianity also had its followers on the steppe, but there is less evidence for this. I've mentioned the Orkhon inscriptions a few times, so let's discuss writing systems. The Chinese histories make contradictory reports, one saying that they used a script like the Eastern barbarians, another that they were illiterate but used notches cut on sticks for record. Archaeological finds have confirmed that they had 2 writing systems that were based on Sogdian, which was in turn based on Aramaic. Sogdian, as the language of the main cities on the Central Asian trade routes, Samarkand, Bukhara, and others, was a regional lingua franca. The Turk and others first used Sogdian for records and messages, before adapting its script to their own language. The Turkic cursive would then go on to form the basis of the Uyghur, Mongol, and Manchu writing system. The other writing system was the runic system, used for the Orkhon inscription and other inscriptions on standing stones across the steppe. Although at first glance it looks similar to Western runes, consisting of angular symbols well suited to being cut into a hard surface. There is no relationship, and it was also derived from Aramaic. Runic writing systems became widespread among the Turkic peoples, being used by Kyrgyz, Bulgars, Khazars, and Pechenegs across all of Eurasia. As I'm sure you have already guessed, the Turks, like other nomadic empires, were keenly interested in trade. As the first empire uniting the steppe from the Chinese border to the borders of the Mediterranean world, they brought the Silk Road to new commercial heights, forming bridges between Byzantium, Persia, China, and India, trading silk, cotton, grain, precious metals, tools, and slaves, as well as spreading literacy. Militarily, the Turk Qaganate was a mixed bag, largely due to their own internal squabbling. There is some suggestion that their initial successes in establishing the empire were partially helped by better quality weaponry. Remember that they were supposedly the metalworkers of the Ruran, but it is unclear how far this might actually be true. The steppe was not a good source for iron. Some travellers noted that the Turk in the merchant towns made a big deal of displaying their iron, as if trying to demonstrate that they had no shortage. On the other hand, the Kyrgyz had a reputation for making swords out of meteorites. It's unlikely that meteorites are any more common in the steppe than elsewhere, so this more likely means that they just didn't have a lot of other iron available. The Turk were highly organized, using a decimal system that would later be employed by the Mongols, with strict stratification and ranks. Armies were organized around geographical locations and directions, and assigned different colors and numbers. Everyone was expected to turn up for mobilization. There was no Turkic word for warrior or soldier, just man. According to Arab historian al-Tabari, the Western Turk Khagans had a special region set aside where hunting was forbidden. Warriors were expected to report there periodically for 3 days of intensive training. The total mobilization of the male population meant that women naturally had to step into the administration and defensive roles. Byzantine sources note a number of female rulers in their dealings with Turkic peoples. Chinese, Arab, and Byzantine sources report women serving as bodyguards, defending camps, and even joining armies. The Strategikon, which is attributed to the late 6th century Emperor Maurice, provides a description, Scythians being used here just as the Byzantine term for any steppe nomads. Quote, "The Scythian peoples are of one way of life and organization. They are without a single government and free of politics. Only the Turks and Avars give thought to military organization. The Turks are numerous and free of the variety and severity of the great number of human affairs. They are trained in nothing but to attack the enemy courageously. The nation of the Avars is the most maleficent, changeable, and experienced in warfare. These people are governed by a single ruler and are subject to cruel punishments from their commanders for their mistakes. Governed not by love but by fear, they bravely bear the toils of battle and hardship. They endure heat and cold and the lack of necessities, being nomads. Being superstitious, secretive, friendless, faithless, and governed by greed, they are contemptuous of oaths. They neither observe compacts, nor are they satisfied with gifts. But even before they accept a gift, they are setting schemes to subvert what has been agreed upon. Skillfully calculating the suitable times, they immediately make use of them, endeavoring to prevail against their enemies by deceit, sudden attacks, and closing off military necessities, rather than strength of hand." The Strategikon notes the differences in Turkic organization. While the Romans and Persians divided their armies into 3, a center and wings, the Turks used small divisions that formed up into a solid line, with a further force held behind for ambushes. The elite took the centre, with subject peoples at the wings. The divisions manoeuvred to maintain distance, switching to wedge-shaped attacking formations, feigning retreat, wheeling around and counter-attacking. The author warns that even in an apparent victory, they must be pursued with caution, as they do not recognize defeat and will continue to attack. The Turk did poorly in wars with the Sassanids at the end of the 6th century, and were then further weakened by succession struggles. The Eastern Khaganate fell to the Tang dynasty in 630, followed by the Western Khaganate in 659. The East retrenched and returned as the Second Türk Qaganate in 682, but it was unable to re-establish hegemony in the West, where they were succeeded by the Khazars. Another multi-ethnic, multilingual empire of Iranian, Finno-Ugric, Slavic and Caucasian peoples, with a Turkic elite and a ruling house from the Ashina clan. From their base on the southern Volga, the Khazars will play a major role in the next few centuries of our story. But before we get into that, we're going to step back a couple of centuries and look at the first Turkic migrations into the Western Steppe, and especially the Bulgars, and how we ended up with two Bulgarias, 2,000 kilometers apart, one on the Volga and one on the Danube. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out the History of Africa podcast. Leave a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Check out the resource page on the RussianEmpireHistoryPodcast.com for further reading, and you can get in touch with me via the website, Twitter, Facebook, or email to hello@theRussianEmpireHistoryPodcast.com. Until next time, goodbye.